Don't forget to subscribe. Afterwards, the wisest and most spiritual books from the greatest authors await you every day. And now buckle up, sit back and we'll begin. Helena Petrovna Blavatsky. The Secret Doctrine. The Solar Theory. A short analysis of the compound and single elements of science as against the occult teachings. How far this theory, as generally accepted, is scientific. In his reply to Drive. Gull's attack on the theory of vitality, which is inseparably connected with the elements of the ancients in the occult philosophy, Professor Beale, the great physiologist, has a few words as suggestive as they are beautiful. There is a mystery in life, a mystery which has never been fathomed, and which appears greater the more deeply the phenomena of life are studied and contemplated. In living centers far more central than the centers seen by the highest magnifying powers, in centers of living matter, where the eye cannot penetrate, but towards which the understanding may tend, proceed changes of the nature of which the most advanced physicists and chemists fail to afford us the conception. Nor is there the slightest reason to think that the nature of these changes will ever be ascertained by physical investigation. Inasmuch as they are certainly of an order or nature totally distinct from that to which any other phenomenon known to us can be relegated. This mystery, or the origin of the life essence, occultism, locates in the same center as the nucleus of prima materia of our solar system, for they are one. As says the commentary, the sun is the heart of the solar world system, and its brain is hidden behind the visible sun. Thence, sensation is radiated into every nerve center of the great body, and the waves of the life essence flow into each artery and vein. The planets are its limbs and pulses. It has been stated elsewhere that occult philosophy denies that the sun is a globe in combustion, but defines it simply as a world, a glowing sphere, the real sun being hidden behind, and the visible sun being only its reflection, its shell. The Nasmyth willow leaves, mistaken by Sir John Herschel for solar inhabitants, are the reservoirs of solar vital energy, the vital electricity that feeds the whole system, the sun in abscondito being thus the storehouse of our little cosmos, self-generating its vital fluid, and ever receiving, as much as it gives out, and the visible sun, only a window cut into the real solar palace and presence, which, however, shews without distortion the interior work. Thus, during the Manvantaric solar period, or life, there is a regular circulation of the vital fluid throughout our system, of which the sun is the heart-like, the circulation of the blood in the human body, the sun contracting as rhythmically as the human heart does at every return of it. Only, instead of performing the round in a second or so, it takes the solar blood 10 of its years to circulate, and a whole year to pass through its auricle and ventricle, before it washes the lungs, and passes thence back to the great arteries and veins of the system. This, science will not deny, since astronomy knows of the fixed cycle of 11 years, when the number of solar spots increases, the increase being due to the contraction of the solar heart. The universe, our world in this case, breathes, just as man and every living creature, plant, and even mineral does upon the earth, and as our globe itself breathes every 24 hours. The dark region is not due to the absorption exerted by the vapors issuing from the bosom of the sun, and interposed between the observer and the photosphere as Father Secchi would have it, nor are the spots formed by the matter-heated gaseous matter itself, which the eruption projects upon the solar disk. The phenomenon is similar to the regular and healthy pulsation of the heart, as the life fluid passes through its hollow muscles. Could the human heart be made luminous, and the living and throbbing organ made visible, so as to have it reflected upon a screen, such as is used by lecturers on astronomy to show the moon, for instance, then everyone would see the sunspot phenomena repeated every second, and that they were due to contraction and the rushing of the blood. We read in a work on geology that it is the dream of science that all the recognized chemical elements will one day be found, but modifications of a single material element. Occult philosophy has taught this since the existence of human speech and language, adding, however, on the principle of the immutable law of analogy, as it is above, so it is below, another of its axioms, that there is neither spirit nor matter in reality, but only numberless aspects of the one ever hidden is, or sat. The homogeneous primordial element is simple and single, only on the terrestrial plane of consciousness and sensation, since matter, after all, is nothing more than the sequence of our own states of consciousness, and spirit, an idea of psychic intuition. Even on the next higher plane, that single element which is defined on our earth by current science as the ultimate undecomposable constituent of some kind of matter, would be pronounced in the world of a higher spiritual perception to be something very complex indeed. Our purest water would be found to yield, instead of its two declared simple elements of oxygen and hydrogen, many other constituents, undreamed of by our modern terrestrial chemistry. As in the realm of matter, so in the realm of spirit, the shadow of that which is cognized on the plane of objectivity exists on that of pure subjectivity. The speck of the perfectly homogeneous substance, the sarcode of the Hegelian monorin, is now viewed as the archebiosis of terrestrial existence, Mr. Huxley's protoplasm, and Bathybius Haeckelii has to be traced to its pre-terrestrial archebiosis. This is first perceived by the astronomers at its third stage of evolution, and in the secondary creation so-called. But the students of esoteric philosophy understand well the secret meaning of the stanza. Brahma has essentially the aspect of Prakriti, both evolved and unevolved. Spirit, O twice-born initiate, is the leading aspect of Brahma. The next is a twofold aspect of Prakriti and Purusha, both evolved and unevolved, and time is the last. Anu is one of the names of Brahma, as distinct from Brahman, and it means atom, Aniyamsam Aniyasam, the most atomic of the atomic, the immutable and imperishable, Achyuta, Purushatama. Surely, then, the elements now known to us, be their number whatever it may as they are understood and defined at present, are not, nor can they be, the primordial elements. Those were formed from the curds of the cold radiant mother and the fire seed of the hot father, who are one, or, to express it in the plainer language of modern science, those elements had their genesis in the depths of the primordial fire mist, the masses of incandescent vapor of the irresolvable nebulae. For, as Professor Newcomb shows, 944 resolvable nebulae do not constitute a class of proper nebulae. More than half of those, he thinks, which were at first mistaken for nebulae, are what he calls starry clusters. The elements now known have arrived at their state of permanency in this fourth round and fifth race. They have a short period of rest before they are propelled once more on their upward spiritual evolution, when the living fire of Orcus will dissociate the most irresolvable and scatter them again into the primordial one. Meanwhile, the occultist goes further, as has been shown in the commentaries on the 7 stanzas. Hence he can hardly hope for any help or recognition from science, which will reject both his Aniyamsam Aniyasam, the absolutely spiritual atom, and his Manasaputras are mind-born men. In resolving the single material element into one absolute irresolvable element, spirit or root matter, thus placing it at once outside the reach and province of physical philosophy, he has, of course, but little in common with the orthodox men of science. He maintains that spirit and matter are two facets of the unknowable unity, their apparently contrasted aspects depending a. on the various degrees of differentiation of matter, and b. on the grades of consciousness attained by man himself. This is, however, metaphysics, and has little to do with physics, however great in its own terrestrial limitation that physical philosophy may now be. Nevertheless, once that science admits, if not the actual existence, at any rate, the possibility of the existence of a universe with its numberless forms, conditions, and aspects built out of a single substance, it has to go further. Unless it also admits the possibility of one element, or the one life of the occultists, it will have to hang up that single substance, especially if limited to only the solar nebulae, in mid-air, like the coffin of Mahomet, though minus the attractive magnet that sustained that coffin. Fortunately for the speculative physicists, if we are unable to state with any degree of precision what the nebular theory does imply, we have, thanks to Professor Winchell and several dissident astronomers, been able to learn what it does not imply. Unfortunately, this is far from clearing even the most simple of the problems that have vexed, and do still vex, the men of learning in their search after truth. We have to proceed with our enquiries, starting with the earliest hypotheses of modern science, if we would discover where and why it sins. Perchance it may be found that Stallo is right, after all, and that the blunders, contradictions and fallacies made by the most eminent men of learning are simply due to their abnormal attitude. They are, and want to remain, materialistic quant mean, and yet the general principles of the atomo-mechanical theory, the basis of modern physics, are substantially identical with the cardinal doctrines of ontological metaphysics. Thus, the fundamental errors of ontology become apparent in proportion to the advance of physical science. Science is honeycombed with metaphysical conceptions, but the scientists will not admit the charge and fight desperately to put atomo-mechanical masks on purely incorporeal and spiritual laws in nature, on our plane, refusing to admit their substantiality even on other planes, the bare existence of which they reject a priori. It is easy to show, however, how scientists, wedded to their materialistic views, have, ever since the days of Newton, endeavored to put false masks on fact and truth. But their task is becoming every year more difficult, and every year also, chemistry, beyond all the other sciences, approaches nearer and nearer the realm of the occult in nature. It is assimilating the very truths taught by the occult sciences for ages, but hitherto bitterly derided. Matter is eternal, says the esoteric doctrine. But the matter the occultists conceive of in its laya, or zero state, is not the matter of modern science, not even in its most rarefied gaseous state. Mr. Crookes' radiant matter would appear matter of the grossest kind in the realm of the beginnings, as it becomes pure spirit before it returns back even to its first point of differentiation. Therefore, when the adept or alchemist adds that, though matter is eternal, for it is pradhana, yet atoms are born at every new manvantara, or reconstruction of the universe, it is no such contradiction as a materialist, who believes in nothing beyond the atom, might think. There is a difference between manifested and unmanifested matter, between pradhana, the beginningless and endless cause, and prakriti, or the manifested effect. Says the shloka, that which is the unevolved cause is emphatically called by the most eminent sages, pradhana, original base, which is subtle prakriti, that which is eternal, and which at once is, and is not, a mere process. That which in modern phraseology is referred to as spirit and matter, is one in eternity as the perpetual cause, and it is neither spirit nor matter, but it rendered in Sanskrit by Tad, that all that is, was, or will be, all that the imagination of man is capable of conceiving. Even the exoteric pantheism of Hinduism renders it as no monotheistic philosophy ever did, for in superb phraseology, its cosmogony begins with the well-known words, "There was neither day nor night, neither heaven nor earth, neither darkness nor light. And there was not aught else apprehensible by the senses or by the mental faculties. There was then, however, one Brahma, essentially Prakriti nature and spirit." For the two aspects of Vishnu which are other than his supreme essential aspect are Prakriti and spirit, O Brahman. When these two other aspects of his no longer subsist, but are dissolved, then that aspect whence form and the rest, creation, proceed anew, is denominated time, O twice born. It is that which is dissolved, or the illusionary dual aspect of that, the essence of which is eternally one, that we call eternal matter, or substance, formless, sexless, inconceivable, even to our sixth sense or mind, in which, therefore, we refuse to see that which monotheists call a personal anthropomorphic God. How are these two propositions that matter is eternal, and that the atom is periodical, and not eternal viewed by exact modern science? The materialistic physicist will criticize and laugh them to scorn. The liberal and progressive man of science, however, the true and earnest scientific searcher after truth, such as the eminent chemist, Mr. Crookes, will corroborate the probability of the two statements. For hardly had the echo of his lecture on the genesis of the elements died away the lecture which, delivered by him before the chemical section of the British Association, at the Birmingham meeting in 1887, so startled every evolutionist who heard or read it. Then there came another in March, 1888. Once more the president of the Chemical Society brought before the world of science and the public the fruits of some new discoveries in the realm of atoms, and these discoveries justified the occult teachings in every way. They are more startling even than the statements made by him in the first lecture, and well deserve the attention of every occultist, theosophist, and metaphysician. This is what he says in his Elements and Meta-Elements, thus justifying Stallow's charges and prevision, with the fearlessness of a scientific mind which loves science for truth's sake, regardless of any consequences to his own glory and reputation. We quote his own words. "Permit me, gentlemen, now to draw your attention for a short time to a subject which concerns the fundamental principles of chemistry, a subject which may lead us to admit the possible existence of bodies which, though neither compounds nor mixtures, are not elements in the strictest sense of the word bodies, which I venture to call meta-elements. To explain my meaning, it is necessary for me to revert to our conception of an element. What is the criterion of an element? Where are we to draw the line between distinct existence and identity? No one doubts that oxygen, sodium, chlorine, sulfur are separate elements, and when we come to such groups as chlorine, bromine, iodine, etc., we still feel no doubt, although were degrees of elementicity admissible, and to that we may ultimately have to come at, might be allowed that chlorine approximates much more closely to bromine than to oxygen, sodium, or sulfur. Again, nickel and cobalt are near to each other, very near, though no one questions their claim to rank as distinct elements. Still, I cannot help asking what would have been the prevalent opinion among chemists had the respective solutions of these bodies and their compounds presented identical colors instead of colors which, approximately speaking, are mutually complementary. Would their distinct nature have even now been recognized? When we pass further and come to the so-called rare earths, the ground is less secure under our feet. Perhaps we may admit scandium, ytterbium, and others of the like sort to elemental rank, but what are we to say in the case of preseo and neodymium, between which there may be said to exist no well-marked chemical difference, their chief claim to separate individuality being slight differences in basicity and crystallizing powers, though their physical distinctions, as shown by spectrum observations, are very strongly marked? Even here we may imagine the disposition of the majority of chemists would incline toward the side of leniency, so that they would admit these two bodies within the charmed circle. Whether in so doing they would be able to appeal to any broad principle is an open question. If we admit these candidates, how in justice are we to exclude the series of elemental bodies or meta-elements made known to us by Cross and Nilsson? Here the spectral differences are well marked, while my own researches on didymium show also a slight difference in basicity between some at least of these doubtful bodies. In the same category must be included the numerous separate elements commonly so-called have been and are being split up. Where then are we to draw the line? The different groupings shade off so imperceptibly the one into the other that it is impossible to erect a definite boundary between any two adjacent bodies, and to say that the body on this side of the line is an element, while the one on the other side is non-elementary, or merely something which simulates or approximates to an element. Wherever an apparently reasonable line might be drawn, it would no doubt be easy at once to assign most bodies to their proper side. As in all cases of classification, the real difficulty comes in when the borderline is approached. Slight chemical differences, of course, are admitted, and, up to a certain point, so are well-marked physical differences. What are we to say, however, when the only chemical difference is an almost imperceptible tendency for the one body of a couple or of a group to precipitate before the other? Again, there are cases where the chemical differences reach the vanishing point, although well-marked physical differences still remain. Here we stumble on a new difficulty. In such obscurities, what is chemical and what is physical? Are we not entitled to call a slight tendency of a nascent amorphous precipitate to fall down in advance of another a physical difference? And may we not call colored reactions depending on the amount of some particular acid present and varying according to the concentration of the solution and to the solvent employed? Chemical differences? I do not see how we can deny elementary character to a body which differs from another by well-marked color or spectrum reactions, while we accord it to another body whose only claim is a very minute difference in basic powers. Having once opened the door wide enough to admit some spectrum differences, we have to inquire how minute a difference qualifies the candidate to pass. I will give instances from my own experience of some of these doubtful candidates. Here the great chemist gives several cases of the very extraordinary behavior of molecules and earths, apparently the same, but which yet, when examined very closely, were found to exhibit differences which, however minute, still show that none of them are simple bodies, and that the 60 or 70 elements accepted in chemistry can no longer cover the ground. Their name, apparently, is Legion, but as the so-called periodic theory stands in the way of an unlimited multiplication of elements, Mr. Crookes is obliged to find some means of reconciling the new discovery with the old theory. That theory, he says, has received such abundant verification that we cannot lightly accept any interpretation of phenomena which fails to be in accordance with it. But if we suppose the elements reinforced by a vast number of bodies slightly differing from each other in their properties, and forming, if I may use the expression, aggregations of nebulae where we formerly saw, or believed we saw, separate stars, the periodic arrangement can no longer be definitely grasped. No longer, that is, if we retain our usual conception of an element. Let us, then, modify this conception. For element-read elementary groups, such elementary groups taking the place of the old elements in the periodic scheme, and the difficulty falls away. In defining an element, let us take not an external boundary, but an internal type. Let us say, the smallest ponderable quantity of yttrium is an assemblage of ultimate atoms, almost infinitely more like each other than they are to the atoms of any other approximating element. It does not necessarily follow that the atoms shall all be absolutely alike among themselves. The atomic weight which we ascribe to yttrium, therefore, merely represents a mean value around which the actual weights of the individual atoms of the element range within certain limits. But if my conjecture is tenable, could we separate atom from atom, we should find them varying within narrow limits on each side of the mean. The very process of fractionation implies the existence of such differences in certain bodies. Thus fact and truth have once more forced the hand of exact science and compelled it to enlarge its views and change its terms, which, masking the multitude, reduced them to one body like the septenary Elohim and their hosts, transformed by the materialistic religionists into one Jehovah. Replace the chemical terms molecule, atom, particle by the words hosts, monads, devas, and one might think the genesis of gods, the primeval evolution of manvantaric intelligent forces, was being described. But the learned lecturer adds to his descriptive remarks something still more suggestive, whether consciously or unconsciously, who knoweth? For he says, until lately such bodies passed muster as elements. They had definite properties, chemical and physical, they had recognized atomic weights. If we take a pure dilute solution of such a body, yttrium for instance, and if we add to it an excess of strong ammonia, we obtain a precipitate which appears perfectly homogeneous. But if instead we add very dilute ammonia in quantity sufficient only to precipitate 1/2 of the base present, we obtain no immediate precipitate. If we stir up the whole thoroughly so as to ensure a uniform mixture of the solution and the ammonia, and set the vessel aside for an hour, carefully excluding dust, we may still find the liquid clear and bright, without any vestige of turbidity. After 3 or 4 hours, however, an opalescence will declare itself, and the next morning a precipitate will have appeared. Now let us ask ourselves, what can be the meaning of this phenomenon? The quantity of precipitant added was insufficient to throw down more than half the yttria present, therefore a process akin to selection has been going on for several hours. The precipitation has evidently not been effected at random, those molecules of the base being decomposed, which happen to come in contact with a corresponding molecule of ammonia, For we have taken care that the liquids should be uniformly mixed, so that one molecule of the original salt would not be more exposed to decomposition than any other. If, further, we consider the time which elapses before the appearance of a precipitate, we cannot avoid coming to the conclusion that the action which has been going on for the first few hours is of a selective character. The problem is not why a precipitate is produced, but what determines or directs some atoms to fall down and others to remain in solution. Out of the multitude of atoms present, what power is it that directs each atom to choose the proper path? We may picture to ourselves some directive force passing the atoms one by one in review, selecting one for precipitation and another for solution till all have been adjusted. The italics in the above passage are ours. Well may a man of science ask himself, what power is it that directs each atom? And what is the meaning of its character being selective? Theists would solve the question by answering God, and would thereby solve nothing philosophically. Occultism answers on its own pantheistic grounds, and teaches the student about gods, monads, and atoms. The learned lecturer sees in it that which is his chief concern. The finger posts and the traces of a path which may lead to the discovery and the full and complete demonstration of an homogeneous element in nature. He remarks, in order that such a selection can be effected, there evidently must be some slight differences between which it is possible to select, and this difference almost certainly must be one of basicity, so slight as to be imperceptible by any test at present known, but susceptible of being nursed and encouraged to a point when the difference can be appreciated by ordinary tests. Occultism, which knows of the existence and presence and nature of the one eternal element, at the first differentiation of which the roots of the tree of life are periodically struck, needs no scientific proofs. It says, ancient wisdom has solved the problem ages ago. Earnest, as well as mocking reader, science is slowly but surely approaching our domains of the occult. It is forced by its own discoveries to adopt Nolan's Volanzar phraseology and symbols. Chemical science is now compelled, by the very force of things, to accept even our illustration of the evolution of the gods and atoms, so suggestively and undeniably figured in the caduceus of Mercury, the god of wisdom, and in the allegorical language of the archaic sages. Says a commentary in the Esoteric Doctrine. The trunk of the Asvatha, the tree of life and being, the rod of the caduceus, grows from and descends at every beginning, every new manvantara, from the two dark wings of the swan, Hansa, of life. The two serpents, the ever-living and its illusion, spirit and matter, whose two heads grow from the one head between the wings, descend along the trunks interlaced in close embrace. The two tails join on earth, the manifested universe, into one, and this is the great illusion, Olanu. Every one knows what the caduceus is, modified considerably by the Greeks. The original symbol with the triple head of the serpent became altered into a rod with a knob, and the two lower heads were separated, thus disfiguring somewhat the original meaning. Yet it is as good an illustration as can be for our purpose, this lyre rod, entwined by two serpents. Verily the wonderful powers of the magic caduceus were sung by all the ancient poets, with a very good reason for those who understood the secret meaning. Now what says the learned president of the Chemical Society of Great Britain, in that same lecture, which has any reference to, or bearing upon, our above-mentioned doctrine? Very little, only this and nothing more. In the Birmingham address already referred to, I asked my audience to picture the action of two forces on the original protyle, one being time, accompanied by a lowering of temperature, the other swinging to and fro like a mighty pendulum, having periodic cycles of ebb and swell, rest and activity, being intimately connected with the imponderable matter, essence, or source of energy we call electricity. Now, a simile like this affects its object if it fixes in the mind a particular fact it is intended to emphasize, but it must not be expected necessarily to run parallel with all the facts. Besides the lowering of temperature with the periodic ebb and flow of electricity, positive or negative, requisite to confer on the newly born elements their particular atomicity, it is evident that a third factor must be taken into account. Nature does not act on a flat plane. She demands space for her cosmogenic operations, and if we introduce space as the third factor, all appears clear. Instead of a pendulum, which, though to a certain extent a good illustration, is impossible as a fact, let us seek some more satisfactory way of representing what I conceive may have taken place. Let us suppose the zigzag diagram not drawn upon a plane, but projected in space of 3 dimensions. What figure can we best select to meet all the conditions involved? Many of the facts can be well explained by supposing the projection in space of Professor Emerson Reynolds's zigzag curve to be a spiral. This figure is, however, inadmissible, inasmuch as the curve has to pass through a point neutral as to electricity and chemical energy twice in each cycle. We must, therefore, adopt some other figure. A figure of 8, or lemniscate, will foreshorten into a zigzag just as well as a spiral, and it fulfills every condition of the problem. A lemniscate for the evolution downward, from spirit into matter, another form of a spiral, perhaps, in its reinvolutionary path onward, from matter into spirit, and the necessary gradual and final reabsorption into the laya state, that which science calls, in her own way, the point neutral as to electricity or the 0 point. Such are the occult facts and statement. They may be left with the greatest security and confidence to science, to be justified someday. Let us hear some more, however, about this primordial genetic type of the symbolical caduceus. Such a figure will result from 3 very simple simultaneous motions. First, a simple oscillation backwards and forwards, suppose east and west. Secondly, a simple oscillation at right angles to the former, suppose north and south, of half the periodic time twice as fast. And thirdly, a motion at right angles to these two, suppose downwards, which, in its simplest form, would be with unvarying velocity. If we project this figure in space, we find on examination that the points of the curves, where chlorine, bromine, and iodine are formed, come close under each other. So also will sulfur, selenium, and tellurium, again, phosphorus, arsenic, and antimony, and in like manner other series of analogous bodies. It may be asked whether this scheme explains how and why the elements appear in this order. Let us imagine a cyclical translation in space, each evolution witnessing the genesis of the group of elements which I previously represented as produced during one complete vibration of the pendulum. Let us suppose that one cycle has thus been completed, the center of the unknown creative force in its mighty journey through space, having scattered along its track the primitive atoms, the seeds, if I may use the expression, which presently are to coalesce and develop into the groupings now known as lithium, beryllium, boron, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, fluorine, sodium, magnesium, aluminium, silicon, phosphorus, sulfur, and chlorine. What is most probably the form of track now pursued? Were it strictly confined to the same plane of temperature and time, the next elementary groupings to appear would again have been those of lithium, and the original cycle would have been eternally repeated, producing again and again the same 14 elements. The conditions, however, are not quite the same. Space and electricity are as at first, but temperature has altered, and thus, instead of the atoms of lithium being supplemented with atoms in all respects analogous with themselves, the atomic groupings which come into being when the second cycle commences form, not lithium, but its lineal descendant, potassium. Suppose, therefore, the vis generatrix traveling to and fro in cycles along a lemniscate path, as above suggested, while simultaneously temperature is declining and time is flowing on variations which I have endeavored to represent by the downward sink. Each coil of the lemniscate track crosses the same vertical line at lower and lower points. Projected in space, the curve shows a central line neutral as far as electricity is concerned, and neutral in chemical properties, positive electricity on the north, negative on the south. Dominant atomicities are governed by the distance east and west from the neutral center line, monatomic elements being one remove from it, diatomic two removes, and so on. In every successive coil the same law holds good. And, as if to prove the postulate of occult science and Hindu philosophy, that, at the hour of the pralaya, the two aspects of the unknowable deity, the swan and darkness prakriti and purusha, nature or matter in all its forms and spirit, no longer subsist but are absolutely dissolved, we learn the conclusive scientific opinion of the great English chemist, who caps his proofs by saying, "We have now traced the formation of the chemical elements from knots and voids in a primitive formless fluid. We have shown the possibility, nay, the probability that the atoms are not eternal in existence, but share with all other created beings the attributes of decay and death." Occultism says amen to this, as the scientific possibility and probability are for it facts, demonstrated beyond the necessity for further proof, or for any extraneous physical evidence. Nevertheless, it repeats with as much assurance as ever. Matter is eternal, becoming atomic, its aspect, only periodically. This is as sure as that the other proposition, which is almost unanimously accepted by astronomers and physicists, namely, that the wear and tear of the body of the universe is steadily going on, and that it will finally lead to the extinction of the solar fires and the destruction of the universe, is quite erroneous on the lines traced by men of science. There will be, as there ever were in time and eternity, periodical dissolutions of the manifested universe, such as a partial pralaya after every day of Brahma, and the universal pralaya, the Mahapralaya, only after the lapse of every age of Brahma. But the scientific causes for such dissolution, as brought forward by exact science, have nothing to do with the true causes. However that may be, occultism is once more justified by science, for Mr. Crookes said, "We have shown, from arguments drawn from the chemical laboratory, that in matter which has responded to every test of an element, there are minute shades of difference which may admit of selection. We have seen that the time-honored distinction between elements and compounds no longer keeps pace with the developments of chemical science, but must be modified to include a vast array of intermediate bodies, meta-elements. We have shown how the objections of Clerk Maxwell, weighty as they are, may be met, and finally, We have adduced reasons for believing that primitive matter was formed by the act of a generative force, throwing off at intervals of time atoms endowed with varying quantities of primitive forms of energy. If we may hazard any conjectures as to the source of energy embodied in a chemical atom, we may, I think, premise that the heat radiations propagated outwards through the ether from the ponderable matter of the universe, by some process of nature not yet known to us, are transformed at the confines of the universe into the essential motions of chemical atoms, which, the instant they are formed, gravitate inwards, and thus restore to the universe the energy which otherwise would be lost to it through radiant heat. If this conjecture be well founded, Sir William Thomson's startling prediction of the final decrepitude of the universe through the dissipation of its energy falls to the ground. In this fashion, gentlemen, it seems to me that the question of the elements may be provisionally treated. Our slender knowledge of these first mysteries is extending steadily, surely, though slowly. By a strange and curious coincidence, even our septenary doctrine seems to force the hand of science. If we understand rightly, chemistry speaks of 14 groupings of primitive atoms: lithium, beryllium, boron, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, fluorine, sodium, magnesium, aluminium, silicon, phosphorus, sulfur and chlorine. And Mr. Crookes, speaking of the dominant atomicities, enumerates 7 groups of these, for he says, "As the mighty focus of creative energy goes round, we see it in successive cycles, sowing in one tract of space seeds of lithium, potassium, rubidium, and cesium, in another tract, chlorine, bromine, and iodine, in a third, sodium, copper, silver, and gold, in a fourth, sulfur, selenium, and tellurium, in a fifth, beryllium, calcium, strontium, and barium, in a sixth, magnesium, zinc, cadmium, and mercury, in a seventh, phosphorus, arsenic, antimony, and bismuth, which makes 7 groupings on the one hand. And after showing in other tracts the other elements, namely, aluminium, gallium, indium, and thallium, silicon, germanium, and tin, carbon, titanium, and zirconium, he adds, while a natural position near the neutral axis is found for the 3 groups of elements relegated by Professor Mendeleev to a sort of hospital for incurables, his 8th family. It might be interesting to compare these 7 and the 8th family of incurables with the allegories concerning the 7 primitive sons of Mother, infinite spacer Aditi, and the 8th son rejected by her. Many a strange coincidence may thus be found between those intermediate links named meta-elements or elementoids, and those whom occult science names their noumenoi, the intelligent minds and rulers of those groupings of monads and atoms. But this would lead us too far. Let us be content with finding the confession of the fact that this deviation from absolute homogeneity should mark the constitution of these molecules or aggregations of matter which we designate elements, and will perhaps be clearer if we return in imagination to the earliest dawn of our material universe and, face to face with the great secret, try to consider the processes of elemental evolution. Thus finally science, in the person of its highest representatives, in order to make itself clearer to the profane, adopts the phraseology of such old adepts as Roger Bacon, and returns to the protyle. All this is hopeful and suggestive of the signs of the times. Indeed, these signs are many and multiply daily, but none are more important than those just quoted. For now, the chasm between the occult, superstitious and unscientific teachings and those of exact science is completely bridged, and one, at least, of the few eminent chemists of the day is in the realm of the infinite possibilities of occultism. Every new step he will take will bring him nearer and nearer to that mysterious center, from which radiate the innumerable paths that lead down spirit into matter, and which transform the gods and the living monads into man and sentient nature. But we have something more to say on this subject in the following section. The coming force. Its possibilities and impossibilities. Shall we say that force is moving matter or matter in motion and a manifestation of energy, or that matter and force are the phenomenal differentiated aspects of the one primary, undifferentiated cosmic substance? This query is made with regard to that stanza which treats of Fohit and his 7 brothers or sons, in other words, of the cause and the effects of cosmic electricity. The brothers or sons of occult parlance being the 7 primary forces of electricity, whose purely phenomenal, and hence grossest, effects are alone cognizable by physicists on the cosmic, and especially on the terrestrial plane. These include, among other things, sound, light, color, etc. Now, what does physical science tell us of these forces? Sound, it says, is a sensation produced by the impact of atmospheric molecules on the tympanum, which, by setting up delicate tremors in the auditory apparatus, thus communicate their vibrations to the brain. Light is the sensation caused by the impact of inconceivably minute vibrations of ether on the retina of the eye. So, too, say we. But these are simply the effects produced in our atmosphere and its immediate surroundings, all, in fact, which falls within the range of our terrestrial consciousness. Jupiter Pluvius sent his symbol in drops of rain, of water composed, as is believed, of 2 elements which chemistry dissociates and recombines. The compound molecules are in its power, but their atoms still elude its grasp. Occultism sees in all these forces and manifestations a ladder, the lower rungs of which belong to exoteric physics, and the higher are traced to a living, intelligent, invisible power, which is, as a rule, the unconcerned, but, exceptionally, the conscious, cause of the sense-born phenomena designated as this or that natural law. We say and maintain that sound, for one thing, is a tremendous occult power, that it is a stupendous force, of which the electricity generated by 1,000,000 of Niagaras could never counteract the smallest potentiality when directed with occult knowledge. Sound may be produced of such a nature that the pyramid of Cheops would be raised in the air, or that a dying man, nay, one at his last breath, would be revived and filled with new energy and vigor. For sound generates, or rather attracts together, the elements that produce an ozone, the fabrication of which is beyond chemistry, but is within the limits of alchemy. It may even resurrect a man or an animal whose astral vital body has not been irreparably separated from the physical body by the severance of the magnetic or erotic cord. As one saved thrice from death by that power, the writer ought to be credited with personally knowing something about it. And if all this appears too unscientific to be even noticed, let science explain to what mechanical and physical laws, known to it, are due the recently produced phenomena of the so-called Keeley motor. What is it that acts as the formidable generator of invisible but tremendous force, of that power which is not only capable of driving an engine of 25 horsepower, but has even been employed to bodily lift the machinery? Yet this is done simply by drawing a fiddle bow across a tuning fork, as has been repeatedly proven. For the etheric force, discovered by John Worrell Keely of Philadelphia, well known in America and Europe, is no hallucination. Notwithstanding his failure to utilize it, a failure prognosticated and maintained by some occultists from the first, the phenomena exhibited by the discoverer during the last few years have been wonderful, almost miraculous, not in the sense of the supernatural, but of the superhuman. Had Keely been permitted to succeed, he might have reduced a whole army to atoms in the space of a few seconds, as easily as he reduced a dead ox to that condition. The reader is now asked to give serious attention to that newly discovered potency, which the discoverer has named interetheric force and forces. In the humble opinion of the occultists, as of his immediate friends, Mr. Keely was, and still is, at the threshold of some of the greatest secrets of the universe, of that chiefly on which is built the whole mystery of physical forces and the esoteric significance of the mundane egg symbolism. Occult philosophy, viewing the manifested and the unmanifested cosmos as a unity, symbolizes the ideal conception of the former by that golden egg with two poles in it. It is the positive pole that acts in the manifested world of matter, while the negative loses itself in the unknowable absoluteness of satbness. Whether this agrees with the philosophy of Mr. Keely, we cannot tell, nor does it really much matter. Nevertheless, his ideas about the ethero-material construction of the universe look strangely like our own, being in this respect nearly identical. This is what we find him saying in an able pamphlet compiled by Mrs. Bloomfield Moore, an American lady of wealth and position, whose incessant efforts in the pursuit of truth can never be too highly appreciated. Mr. Keely, in explanation of the working of his engine, says, "In the conception of any machine heretofore constructed, the medium for inducing a neutral center has never been found. If it had, the difficulties of perpetual motion seekers would have ended, and this problem would have become an established and operating fact. It would only require an introductory impulse of a few pounds on such a device to cause it to run for centuries. In the conception of my vibratory engine, I did not seek to attain perpetual motion, but a circuit is formed that actually has a neutral center, which is in a condition to be vivified by my vibratory ether, and, while under operation by said substance, is really a machine that is virtually independent of the mass, or globe, and it is the wonderful velocity of the vibratory circuit which makes it so. Still, with all its perfection, it requires to be fed with the vibratory ether to make it an independent motor. All structures require a foundation and strength according to the weight of the mass they have to carry, but the foundations of the universe rest on a vacuous point far more minute than a molecule. In fact, to express this truth properly, on an interetheric point, which requires an infinite mind to understand it. To look down into the depths of an etheric center is precisely the same as it would be to search into the broad space of heaven's ether to find the end, with this difference: that one is the positive field, while the other is the negative field. This is, as may easily be seen, precisely the Eastern doctrine. Mr. Keely's interetheric point is the Laya point of the occultists. This, however, does not require an infinite mind to understand it, but only a specific intuition and ability to trace its hiding place in this world of matter. Of course, the Laya center cannot be produced, but an interetheric vacuum can be, as is proved by the production of bell sounds in space. Mr. Keely speaks as an unconscious occultist, Nevertheless, when he remarks, in his theory of planetary suspension, as regards planetary volume, we would ask in a scientific point of view, how can the immense difference of volume in the planets exist without disorganizing the harmonious action that has always characterized them? I can only answer this question properly by entering into a progressive analysis. Starting on the rotating etheric centers that were fixed by the Creator with their attractive or accumulative power. If you ask what power it is that gives to each etheric atom its inconceivable velocity of rotation, or introductory impulse, I must answer that no finite mind will ever be able to conceive what it is. The philosophy of accumulation is the only proof that such a power has been given. The area, if we can so speak, of such an atom presents to the attractive or magnetic, the elective or propulsive, all the receptive force and all the antagonistic force that characterize a planet of the largest magnitude. Consequently, as the accumulation goes on, the perfect equation remains the same. When this minute center has once been fixed, the power to rend it from its position would necessarily have to be so great as to displace the most immense planet that exists. When this atomic neutral center is displaced, the planet must go with it. The neutral center carries the full load of any accumulation from the start and remains the same, forever balanced in the eternal space. Mr. Keeley illustrates his idea of a neutral center in this way. We will imagine that, after an accumulation of a planet of any diameter, say, 20,000 miles, more or less, for the size has nothing to do with the problem, there should be a displacement of all the material, with the exception of a crust 5,000 miles thick, leaving an intervening void between this crust and a center of the size of an ordinary billiard ball. It would then require a force as great to move this small central mass as it would to move the shell of 5,000 miles thickness. Moreover, this small central mass would carry the load of this crust forever, keeping it equidistant, and there could be no opposing power, however great, that could bring them together. The imagination staggers in contemplating the immense load which bears upon this point of center, where weight ceases. This is what we understand by a neutral center. And this is what occultists understand by a Laya center. The above is pronounced to be unscientific by many. But so is everything that is not sanctioned and kept on the strictly orthodox lines of physical science. Unless the explanation given by the inventor himself is accepted and his explanations, being quite orthodox from the spiritual and the occult standpoints, if not from that of materialistic speculative science, called exact, are therefore ours in this particular. What can science answer to facts already seen, which it is no longer possible for anyone to deny? Occult philosophy divulges few of its most important vital mysteries. It drops them like precious pearls, one by one, far and wide apart, and even this only when forced to do so by the evolutionary tidal wave that carries on humanity slowly, silently, but steadily, toward the dawn of the sixth race mankind. For once out of the safe custody of their legitimate heirs and keepers, those mysteries cease to be occult. They fall into the public domain and have to run the risk of becoming curses more often than blessings in the hands of the selfish of the Cains of the human race. Nevertheless, whenever such individuals as the discoverer of etheric force are born, men with peculiar psychic and mental capacities, they are generally and more frequently helped than allowed to go unassisted, groping on their way. If left to their own resources, they very soon fall victims to martyrdom, or become the prey of unscrupulous speculators. But they are helped only on the condition that they should not become, whether consciously or unconsciously, an additional peril to their age. A danger to the poor, now offered in daily holocaust by the less wealthy to the very wealthy. This necessitates a short digression and an explanation. Some 12 years back, during the Philadelphia Centennial Exhibition, the writer, in answering the earnest queries of a theosophist, one of the earliest admirers of Mr. Keeley, repeated to him what she had heard in quarters, information from which she could never doubt. It had been stated that the inventor of the self-motor was what is called, in the jargon of the Kabbalists, a natural-born magician. That he was and would remain unconscious of the full range of his powers, and would work out merely those which he had found out and ascertained in his own nature, firstly, because, attributing them to a wrong source, he could never give them full sway, and secondly, because it was beyond his power to pass to others that which was a capacity inherent in his own special nature. Hence, the whole secret could not be made over permanently to anyone, for practical purposes or use. Individuals born with such a capacity are not very rare. That they are not heard of more frequently is due to the fact that they live and die, in almost every case, in utter ignorance that they are possessed of abnormal powers. Mr. Keeley possesses powers which are called abnormal just because they happen to be as little known in our day as was the circulation of the blood before Harvey's time. Blood existed, and it behaved as it does at present in the first man born from woman, and so exists and has existed in man that principle which can control and guide etheric vibratory force. At any rate, it exists in all those mortals whose inner selves are primordially connected, by reason of their direct descent, with that group of Dayan Chohans who are called the firstborn of either. Mankind, psychically considered, is divided into various groups, each group being connected with one of the Dianic groups that first formed psychic man. Mr. Keeley being greatly favored in this respect, and besides his psychic temperament, being, moreover, intellectually a genius in mechanics, may achieve most wonderful results. He has achieved some already more than any mortal man, not initiated into the final mysteries, has achieved in this age up to the present day. What he has done is, as his friends justly say of him, certainly quite sufficient to demolish with the hammer of science the idols of science, the idols of matter, with the feet of clay. Nor would the writer for a moment think of contradicting Mrs. Bloomfield Moore when, in her paper on psychic force and etheric force, she states that Mr. Keeley, as a philosopher, is great enough in soul, wise enough in mind, and sublime enough in courage to overcome all difficulties, and to stand at last before the world as the greatest discoverer and inventor in the world. And again she writes, should Keeley do no more than lead scientists from the dreary realms where they are groping into the open field of elemental force, where gravity and cohesion are disturbed in their haunts and diverted to use, where, from unity of origin, emanates infinite energy in diversified forms, he will achieve immortal fame. Should he demonstrate, to the destruction of materialism, that the universe is animated by a mysterious principle to which matter, however perfectly organized, is absolutely subservient, he will be a greater spiritual benefactor to our race than the modern world has yet found in any man. Should he be able to substitute, in the treatment of disease, the finer forces of nature for the grossly material agencies which have sent more human beings to their graves than war, pestilence and famine combined, he will merit and receive the gratitude of mankind. All this and more will he do, if he and those who have watched his progress, day by day for years, are not too sanguine in their expectations. The same lady, in her pamphlet, Keely's Secrets, brings forward the following passage from an article written in the Theosophist a few years ago by the writer of the present volume, the author of No. 5 of the pamphlets issued by the Theosophical Publication Society, What is Matter and What is Force, says therein, "The men of science have just found out a fourth state of matter, whereas the occultists have penetrated years ago beyond the sixth, and therefore do not infer, but know of, the existence of the seventh, the last. This knowledge comprises one of the secrets of Keely's so-called compound secret. It is already known to many that his secret includes the augmentation of energy, the insulation of the ether, and the adaptation of dynaspheric force to machinery. It is just because Keely's discovery would lead to a knowledge of one of the most occult secrets, a secret which can never be allowed to fall into the hands of the masses, that his failure to push his discoveries to their logical end seems certain to occultists. But of this more presently. Even in its limitations, this discovery may prove of the greatest benefit. 4. Step by step, with a patient perseverance which someday the world will honor, this man of genius has made his researches, overcoming the colossal difficulties which again and again raised up in his path what seemed to be, to all but himself, insurmountable barriers to further progress. But never has the world's index finger so pointed to an hour when all is making ready for the advent of the new form of force that mankind is waiting for. Nature, always reluctant to yield her secrets, is listening to the demands made upon her by her master, necessity. The coal mines of the world cannot long afford the increasing drain made upon them. Steam has reached its utmost limits of power and does not fulfill the requirements of the age. It knows that its days are numbered. Electricity holds back, with bated breath, dependent upon the approach of her sister colleague. Airships are riding at anchor, as it were, waiting for the force which is to make aerial navigation something more than a dream. As easily as men communicate with their offices from their homes by means of the telephone, so will the inhabitants of separate continents talk across the ocean. Imagination is palsied when seeking to foresee the grand results of this marvelous discovery, when once it is applied to art and mechanics. In taking the throne which it will force steam to abdicate, dynaspheric force will rule the world with a power so mighty in the interests of civilization that no finite mind can conjecture the results. Lawrence Oliphant, in his preface to Scientific Religion, says, "A new moral future is dawning upon the human race, one, certainly, of which it stands much in need. In no way could this new moral future be so widely, so universally, commenced as by the utilizing of dynaspheric force to beneficial purposes in life. The occultists are ready to admit all this with the eloquent writer. Molecular vibration is, undeniably, Keely's legitimate field of research, and the discoveries made by him will prove wonderful yet only in his hands and through himself. The world so far will get but that with which it can be safely entrusted." The truth of this assertion has, perhaps, not yet quite dawned upon the discoverer himself, since he writes that he is absolutely certain that he will accomplish all that he has promised, and that he will then give it out to the world, but it must dawn upon him, and at no very far distant date. And what he says in reference to his work is a good proof of it. In considering the operation of my engine, the visitor, in order to have even an approximate conception of its modus operandi, must discard all thought of engines that are operated upon the principle of pressure and exhaustion, by the expansion of steam or other analogous gas, which impinges upon an abutment, such as the piston of a steam engine. My engine has neither piston nor eccentrics, nor is there one grain of pressure exerted in the engine, whatever may be the size or capacity of it. My system, in every part and detail, both in the developing of my power and in every branch of its utilization, is based and founded on sympathetic vibration. In no other way would it be possible to awaken or develop my force, and equally impossible would it be to operate my engine upon any other principle. This, however, is the true system, and henceforth all my operations will be conducted in this manner, that is to say, my power will be generated, my engines run, my cannon operated, through a wire. It has been only after years of incessant labor and the making of almost innumerable experiments, involving not only the construction of a great many most peculiar mechanical structures and the closest investigation and study of the phenomenal properties of the substance ether per se produced, that I have been able to dispense with complicated mechanism and to obtain, as I claim, mastery over the subtle and strange force with which I am dealing. The passages underlined by us are those which bear directly on the occult side of the application of the vibratory force, that which Mr. Keeley calls sympathetic vibration. The wire is already a step below, or downward from the pure etheric plane into the terrestrial. The discoverer has produced marvels. The word miracle is not too strong when acting through the interetheric force alone, the fifth and sixth principles of Akasha. From a generator 6 feet long, he has come down to one no larger than an old-fashioned silver watch, and this by itself is a miracle of mechanical, but not of spiritual, genius. As was well said by his great patroness and defender Mrs. Bloomfield Moore, the two forms of force which he has been experimenting with, and the phenomena attending them, are the very antithesis of each other. One was generated and acted upon by and through himself. No one, who should have repeated the thing done by himself, could have produced the same results. It was truly Keeley's ether that acted, while Smith's or Brown's ether would have remained forever barren of results. For Keeley's difficulty has hitherto been to produce a machine which would develop and regulate the force, without the intervention of any willpower or personal influence of the operator, whether conscious or unconscious. In this he has failed, so far as others were concerned, for no one but himself could operate on his machines. Occultly, this was a far more advanced achievement than the success which he anticipates from his wire, but the results obtained from the fifth and sixth planes of the etheric or astral force will never be permitted to serve for purposes of commerce and traffic. That Keeley's organism is directly connected with the production of his marvelous results is proven by the following statement, emanating from one who knows the great discoverer intimately. At one time the shareholders of the Keeley Motor Company put a man in his workshop for the express purpose of discovering his secret. After 6 months of close watching, he said to J.W. Keeley one day, "I know how it is done, now." They had been setting up a machine together, and Keeley was manipulating the stopcock which turned the force on and off. "Try it," then was the answer. The man turned the cock, and nothing came. "Let me see you do it again," the man said to Keeley. The latter complied, and the machinery operated at once. Again the other tried, but without success. Then Keely put his hand on his shoulder and told him to try once more. He did so, with the result of an instantaneous production of the current. This fact, if true, settles the question. We are told that Mr. Keely defines electricity as a certain form of atomic vibration. In this he is quite right, but this is electricity on the terrestrial plane and through terrestrial correlations. He estimates molecular vibrations at 100 million per second. Intermolecular vibrations at 300 million per second. Atomic vibrations at 900 million per second. Interatomic vibrations at 2,700 million per second. Etheric vibrations at 8,100 million per second. Interetheric vibrations at 24,300 million per second. This proves our point. There are no vibrations that could be counted or even estimated at an approximate rate, beyond the realm of the fourth son of Fohit, to use an occult phrase, or that motion which corresponds to the formation of Mr. Crookes' radiant matter, lightly called some years ago the fourth state of matter on this our plane. If the question is asked why Mr. Keely was not allowed to pass a certain limit, the answer is easy. It was because that, which he has unconsciously discovered, is the terrible sidereal force, known to, and named by the Atlanteans Mashmak, and by the Aryan Rishis in their Astrovidya by a name that we do not like to give. It is the vril of Bulwer-Lytton's coming race, and of the coming races of our mankind. The name vril may be a fiction. The force itself is a fact, as little doubted in India as is the existence of the Rishis, since it is mentioned in all the secret books. It is this vibratory force, which, when aimed at an army from an Aniratha, fixed on a flying vessel, a balloon, according to the instructions found in Astrovidya, would reduce to ashes 100,000 men and elephants, as easily as it would a dead rat. It is allegorized in the Vishnu Purana, in the Ramayana and other works, in the fable about the sage Kapila, whose glance made a mountain of ashes of King Sagara's 60,000 sons, and which is explained in the esoteric works, and referred to as the Kapalaksha Kapila's eye. And is it this satanic force that our generations are to be allowed to add to their stock of anarchists' baby toys, known as melanite, dynamite clockwork, explosive oranges, flower baskets and such other innocent names? Is it this destructive agency, which, once in the hands of some modern Attila, a bloodthirsty anarchist, for instance, would in a few days reduce Europe to its primitive chaotic state? With no man left alive to tell the tale, is it this force which is to become the common property of all men alike? What Mr. Keely has already done is grand and wonderful in the extreme. There is enough work before him in the demonstration of his new system to humble the pride of those scientists who are materialistic by revealing those mysteries which lie behind the world of matter without, nolens volens, revealing it to all. For surely psychics and spiritualists, of whom there are a good number in European armies, would be the first to personally experience the fruits of the revelation of such mysteries. Thousands of them would speedily find themselves in blue ether, perhaps with the populations of whole countries to keep them company, were such a force to be even entirely discovered, let alone made publicly known. The discovery in its completeness is by several thousand, or shall we say 100,000 years too premature. It will be in its appointed place and time only when the great roaring flood of starvation, misery, and underpaid labor ebbs back again as it will when the just demands of the many are at last happily attended to, when the proletariat exists but in name, and the pitiful cry for bread, that rings unheeded throughout the world, has died away. This may be hastened by the spread of learning, and by new openings for work and immigration, with better prospects than now exist, and on some new continent that may appear. Then only will Keely's motor and force, as originally contemplated by himself and his friends, be in demand, because it will then be more needed by the poor than by the wealthy. Meanwhile, the force he has discovered will work through wires, and, if he succeeds, this will be quite sufficient to make of him the greatest discoverer of the age in the present generation. What Mr. Keely says of sound and color is also correct from the occult standpoint. Hear him talk as though he were the nursling of the gods' revealers, and as if he had gazed all his life into the depths of Father Mother Ether. In comparing the tenuity of the atmosphere with that of the etheric flows, obtained by his invention for breaking up the it is as platinum to hydrogen gas. Molecular separation of air brings us to the first subdivision only, intermolecular, to the second, atomic, to the third, interatomic, to the fourth, etheric, to the fifth, and interetheric, to the sixth subdivision, or positive association with luminiferous ether. In my introductory argument, I have contended that this is the vibratory envelope of all atoms. In my definition of atom, I do not confine myself to the sixth subdivision, where this luminiferous ether is developed in its crude form, as far as my researches prove. I think this idea will be pronounced by the physicists of the present day a wild freak of the imagination. Possibly, in time, a light may fall upon this theory that will bring its simplicity forward for scientific research. At present, I can only compare it to some planet in a dark space, where the light of the sun of science has not yet reached it. I assume that sound, like odor, is a real substance of unknown and wonderful tenuity, emanating from a body where it has been induced by percussion, and throwing out absolute corpuscles of matter, interatomic particles, with velocity of 1,120 feet per second, in vacuo 20,000. The substance which is thus disseminated is a part and parcel of the mass agitated, and, if kept under this agitation continuously, would, in the course of a certain cycle of time, become thoroughly absorbed by the atmosphere, or, more truly, would pass through the atmosphere to an elevated point of tenuity, corresponding to the condition of subdivision that governs its liberation from its parent body. The sounds from vibratory forks, set so as to produce etheric chords, while disseminating their tones, compound, permeate most thoroughly all substances that come under the range of their atomic bombardment. The clapping of a bell in vacuo liberates these atoms with the same velocity and volume as one in the open air, and were the agitation of the bell kept up continuously for a few millions of centuries, it would thoroughly return to its primitive element, and, if the chamber were hermetically sealed and strong enough, the vacuous volume surrounding the bell would be brought to a pressure of many thousands of pounds to the square inch by the tenuous substance evolved. In my estimation, sound truly defined is the disturbance of atomic equilibrium, rupturing actual atomic corpuscles, and the substance thus liberated must certainly be a certain order of etheric flow. Under these conditions, is it unreasonable to suppose that, if this flow were kept up, and the body thus robbed of its element, it would in time disappear entirely? All bodies are formed primitively from this highly tenuous ether, animal, vegetable, and mineral, and they are only returned to their high gaseous condition when brought under a state of differential equilibrium. As regards odor, we can only get some definite idea of its extreme and wondrous tenuity by taking into consideration that a large area of atmosphere can be impregnated for a long series of years from a single grain of musk, which, if weighed after that long interval, will be found to be not appreciably diminished. The great paradox attending the flow of odorous particles is that they can be held under confinement in a glass vessel. Here is a substance of much higher tenuity than the glass that holds it, and yet it cannot escape. It is as a sieve with its meshes large enough to pass marbles, and yet holding fine sand which cannot pass through. In fact, a molecular vessel holding an atomic substance. This is a problem that would confound those who stop to recognize it. But infinitely tenuous as odor is, it holds a very crude relation to the substance of subdivision that governs a magnetic flow, a flow of sympathy, if you please to call it so. This subdivision comes next to sound, but is above sound. The action of the flow of a magnet coincides somewhat to the receiving and distributing portion of the human brain, giving off at all times a depreciating ratio of the amount received. It is a grand illustration of the control of mind over matter, which gradually depreciates the physical till dissolution takes place. The magnet on the same ratio gradually loses its power and becomes inert. If the relations that exist between mind and matter could be equated and so held, we would live on in our physical state eternally, as there would be no physical depreciation. But this physical depreciation leads, at its terminus, to the source of a much higher development, the liberation of the pure ether from the crude molecular, which, in my estimation, is to be much desired. It may be remarked that, save for a few small divergencies, no adept nor alchemist could have better explained these theories in the light of modern science, however much the latter may protest against these novel views. In all its fundamental principles, if not in its details, this is occultism pure and simple, and moreover, it is modern natural philosophy as well. This new force, or whatever science may call it, the effects of which are undeniable as is admitted by more than one naturalist and physicist who has visited Mr. Keely's laboratory and personally witnessed its tremendous effects. What is it? Is it a mode of motion also, in vacuo, since there is no matter to generate it, except sound? Another mode of motion, no doubt, a sensation caused, like color, by vibrations? Fully as we believe in these vibrations as the proximate, the immediate, cause of such sensations, we as absolutely reject the one-sided scientific theory that there is no factor to be considered as external to us, other than etheric or atmospheric vibrations. In this case, the American substantialists are not wrong, though they are too anthropomorphic and material in their views for these to be accepted by occultists, when they argue through Mrs. M.S. Organ that there must be positive entitative properties in objects which have a constitutional relation to the nerves of animal sensations, or there can be no perception. No impression of any kind can be made upon brain, nerve, or mind, no stimulus to action unless there is an actual and direct communication of a substantial force. Substantial as far as it appears, in the usual sense of the word, in this universe of illusion and maya, of course, not in reality. That force may be the most refined and sublimated immaterial entity. Yet it must exist, for no sense, element, or faculty of the human being can have a perception, or be stimulated into action, without some substantial force coming in contact with it. This is the fundamental law pervading the whole organic and mental world. In the true philosophical sense, there is no such thing as independent action. For every force or substance is correlated to some other force or substance. We can with just as much truth and reason assert that no substance possesses any inherent gustatory property, or any olfactory property, that taste and odor are simply sensations caused by vibrations, and hence mere illusions of animal perceptions. There is a transcendental set of causes put in motion, so to speak, in the occurrence of these phenomena, which, not being in relation to our narrow range of cognition, can only be understood and traced to their source and their nature by the spiritual faculties of the adept. They are, as Asclepius puts it to the king, incorporeal corporealities such as appear in the mirror and abstract forms that we see, hear, and smell in our dreams and visions. What of the modes of motion, light and ether, to do with these? Yet we see, hear, smell and touch them, ergo they are as much realities to us in our dreams as any other thing on this plane of Maya. On the elements and atoms. When the occultist speaks of elements, and of human beings who lived during those geological ages, the duration of which it is found as impossible to determine according to the opinion of one of the best English geologists as the nature of matter, it is because he knows what he is talking about. When he says man and elements, he means neither man in his present physiological and anthropological form, nor the elemental atoms, those hypothetical conceptions existing at present in scientific minds, the entitative abstractions of matter in its highly attenuated state, nor, again, does he mean the compound elements of antiquity. In occultism, the word element in every case means rudiment. When we say elementary man, we mean either the promeal, incipient sketch of man, in its unfinished and undeveloped condition, hence in that form which now lies latent in physical man during his lifetime, and takes shape only occasionally and under certain conditions, or that form which for a time survives the material body, and which is better known as an elementary. With regard to element, when the term is used metaphysically, it means, in distinction to the mortal, the incipient divine man, and, in its physical usage, it means inchoate matter in its first undifferentiated condition, or in the laya state, the eternal and normal condition of substance, which differentiates only periodically. During that differentiation, substance is really in an abnormal state. In other words, it is but a transitory illusion of the senses. As to the elemental atoms, so called, the occultists refer to them by that name with a meaning analogous to that which is given by the Hindu to Brahma when he calls him Anu, the atom. Every elemental atom, in search of which more than one chemist has followed the path indicated by the alchemists, is, in their firm belief, when not knowledge, a soul, not necessarily a disembodied soul, but a jiva, as the Hindus call it, a center of potential vitality, with latent intelligence in it, and, in the case of compound souls, an intelligent active existence, from the highest to the lowest order. A form composed of more or less differentiations. It requires a metaphysician and an Eastern metaphysician to understand our meaning. All those atom souls are differentiations from the One, and are in the same relation to it as is the divine soul, buddhi, to its informing and inseparable spirit, Atma. Modern physics, in borrowing from the ancients their atomic theory, forgot one point, the most important point of the doctrine, hence they have got only the husks, and will never be able to get the kernel. In adopting physical atoms, they omitted the suggestive fact that, from Anaxagoras to Epicurus, to the Roman Lucretius, and finally even to Galileo, all these philosophers believed more or less in animated atoms, not in invisible specks of so-called brute matter. According to them, rotatory motion was generated by larger, red, more divine and pure atoms forcing other atoms downwards, the lighter ones being simultaneously thrust upward. The esoteric meaning of this is the ever-cyclic curve of differentiated elements downward and upward through intercyclic phases of existence, until each again reaches its starting point or birthplace. The idea was metaphysical as well as physical, the hidden interpretation embracing gods or souls, in the shape of atoms, as the causes of all the effects produced on earth by the secretions from the divine bodies. No ancient philosopher, not even the Jewish Kabbalists, ever dissociated spirit from matter or matter from spirit. Everything originated in the One, and, proceeding from the One, must finally return to the One. Light becomes heat and consolidates into fiery particles, which, from being ignited, become cold, hard particles, round and smooth. And this is called soul, imprisoned in its robe of matter. Atoms and souls were synonymous in the language of the initiates. The doctrine of whirling souls Gilgalim, in which so many learned Jews have believed, had no other meaning esoterically. The learned Jewish initiates never meant Palestine alone by the Promised Land, but they meant the same nirvana as do the learned Buddhist and Brahmin, the bosom of the Eternal One, symbolized by that of Abraham, and by Palestine as its substitute on earth. Surely no educated Jew ever believed this allegory in its literal sense, that the bodies of Jews contain within them a principle of soul which cannot rest, if the bodies are deposited in a foreign land, until, by a process called the whirling of the soul, the immortal particle reaches once more the sacred soil of the Promised Land. The meaning of this is evident to an occultist. The process was supposed to be accomplished by a kind of metempsychosis, the psychic spark being conveyed through bird, beast, fish, and the most minute insect. The allegory relates to the atoms of the body, each of which has to pass through every form before all reach the final state, which is the first starting point of the departure of every atom its primitive laya state. But the primitive meaning of Gilgalim, or the revolution of souls, was the idea of the reincarnating souls or egos. All the souls go into the Gulgula into a cyclic or revolving process, i.e., they all proceed on the cyclic path of rebirths. Some Kabbalists interpret this doctrine to mean only a kind of purgatory for the souls of the wicked. But this is not so. The passage of the soul atom through the 7 planetary chambers had the same metaphysical and physical meaning. It had the latter when it was said to dissolve into ether. Even Epicurus, the model atheist and materialist, knew so much and believed so much in the ancient wisdom that he taught that the soul entirely distinct from a mortal spirit, when the former is enshrined latent in it, as it is in every atomic speck, was composed of a fine tender essence, formed from the smoothest, roundest, and finest atoms. And this shows that the ancient initiates, who were followed more or less closely by all profane antiquity, meant by the term atom, a soul, a genius or angel, the firstborn of the ever-concealed cause of all causes, and in this sense their teachings become comprehensible. They asserted, as do their successors, the existence of gods and genii, angels or demons, not outside, nor independent of, the universal plenum, but within it. Only this plenum, during the life cycles, is infinite. They admitted and taught a good deal of that which modern science now teaches, namely, the existence of a primordial world stuff or cosmic substance, eternally homogeneous, except during its periodic existence. Then, universally diffused throughout infinite space, it differentiates and gradually forms sidereal bodies from itself. They taught the revolution of the heavens, the Earth's rotation, the heliocentric system, and the atomic vortices, atoms being in reality souls and intelligences. These atomists were spiritual, most transcendental, and philosophical pantheists. It is not they who would have ever conceived or dreamed that monstrous contrasted progeny, the nightmare of our modern civilized race. Inanimate material and self-guiding atoms, on the one hand, and an extra cosmic God on the other. It may be useful to show what the monad was, and what its origin, in the teachings of the old initiates. Modern exact science, as soon as it began to grow out of its teens, perceived the great, and to it hitherto esoteric, axiom, that nothing, whether in the spiritual, psychic, or physical realm of being, could come into existence out of nothing. There is no cause in the manifested universe without its adequate effects, whether in space or time, nor can there be an effect without its primal cause, which itself owes its existence to a still higher one, the final and absolute cause, having to remain to man forever an incomprehensible causeless cause. But even this is no solution, and must be viewed, if at all, from the highest philosophical and metaphysical standpoints, otherwise the problem had better be left unapproached. It is an abstraction, on the verge of which human reason, however trained in metaphysical subtleties, trembles, threatening to collapse. This may be demonstrated to any European who would undertake to solve the problem of existence by the articles of faith of the true Vedantin, for instance. Let him read and study the sublime teachings of Shankaracharya on the subject of soul and spirit, and the reader will realize what is now said. While the Christian is taught that the human soul is a breath of God, being created by him for some paternal existence, having a beginning, but no end, and therefore never to be called eternal, the occult teaching says, nothing is created, it is only transformed. Nothing can manifest itself in this universe from a globe down to a vague rapid thought that was not in the universe already. Everything on the subjective plane is an eternal is, as everything on the objective plane is an ever-becoming, because all is transitory. The monad, a truly indivisible thing as defined by Good, who did not give it the sense we now do, is here rendered as the Atma, in conjunction with Buddhi and the higher manas. This trinity is one and eternal, the latter being absorbed in the former at the termination of all conditioned and illusive life. The monad, then, can be traced through the course of its pilgrimage, and in its changes of transitory vehicles, only from the incipient stage of the manifested universe. In Pralaya, the intermediate period between two Manvantaras, it loses its name, as it loses it when the real one self of man merges into Brahman, in cases of high samadhi, the Turiya state, or final nirvana, in the words of Shankara. When the disciple, having attained that primeval consciousness, absolute bliss, of which the nature is truth, which is without form and action, abandons this illusive body that has been assumed by the Atma, just as an actor abandons the dress put on. For Buddhi, the Anandamaya sheath is but a mirror which reflects absolute bliss, and, moreover, that reflection itself is yet not free from ignorance, and is not the supreme spirit, since it is subject to conditions, is a spiritual modification of Prakriti, and as an effect, Atma alone is the one real and eternal substratum of all, the essence and absolute knowledge, the Kshatrajna. Now that the revised version of the Gospels has been published and the most glaring mistranslations of the old versions are corrected, one can understand better the words in 1 John v6. It is the Spirit that beareth witness because the Spirit is truth. The words that follow in the mistranslated version about the three witnesses hitherto supposed to stand for the Father, the Word, and the Holy Ghost show the real meaning of the writer very clearly, thus still more forcibly identifying his teaching in this respect with that of Shankaracharya. For what can the sentence mean? There are three that bear witness. The spirit and the water and the blood, if it bears no relation to, nor connection with, the more philosophical statement of the great Vedantin teacher, who, speaking of the sheaths, the principles in Manjiva, Vijnanamaya, etc., which are, in their physical manifestation, water and blood are life, adds that Atma, spirit, alone is what remains after the subtraction of the sheaths, and that it is the only witness, or synthesized unity. The less spiritual and philosophical school, solely with an eye to a trinity, made three witnesses out of one, thus connecting it more with earth than with heaven. It is called in esoteric philosophy the one witness, and, while it rests in devachan, is referred to as the three witnesses to karma. Atma, our seventh principle, being identical with the universal spirit, and man being one with it in his essence, what is then the monad proper? It is that homogeneous spark which radiates in millions of rays from the primeval seven, of which seven something will be said further on. It is the emanating spark from the uncreated Raya mystery. In the esoteric, and even exoteric Buddhism of the North, Adi Buddha, Chogi Dangpoi Sanji, the one unknown, without beginning or end, identical with Parabrahman and Ain Suf, emits a bright ray from its darkness. This is the Logos, the first, or Vajradhara, the Supreme Buddha, also called Dorjichang. As the Lord of all mysteries, he cannot manifest, but sends into the world of manifestation his heart, the diamond heart Vajrasattva or Dorjasempa. This is the second Logos of creation, from whom emanate the seven in the exoteric blind, the five Dhyani Buddhas, called the Anupadaka, the parentless. These Buddhas are the primeval monads from the world of incorporeal being, the Arupa world, wherein the intelligences, on that plane only, have neither shape nor name, in the exoteric system, but have their distinct seven names in the esoteric philosophy. These Dhyani Buddhas emanate, or create from themselves, by virtue of dhyana, celestial selves, the superhuman bodhisattvas. These, incarnating at the beginning of every human cycle on earth as mortal men, become occasionally, owing to their personal merit, bodhisattvas among the sons of humanity, after which they may appear as Manushi, or human, Buddhas. The Anupadaka, or Dhyani Buddhas, are thus identical with the Brahmanical Manasaputra, mind-born sons whether of Brahma, or of either of the other two Trimershan hypostases. They are identical also with the Rishis and Prajapatis. Thus, a passage is found in Anujita, which, read esoterically, shows plainly, though under another imagery, the same idea and system. It says, "Whatever entities there are in this world, movable or immovable, they are the very first to be dissolved at pralaya, and next the developments produced from the elements from which the visible universe is fashioned, and, after these developments evolved entities, all the elements." Such is the upward gradation among entities. Gods, men, Gandharvas, Pishachas, Asuras, Rakshasas, all have been created by nature's Svabhava, or Prakriti, plastic nature, not by actions, nor by a cause, not by any physical cause. These Brahmanas, the creators of the world, are born here on earth again and again. And whatever is produced from them is dissolved in due time in those very five great elements, the five, or rather seven, dhyani Buddhas, also called elements of mankind, like billows in the ocean. These great elements are in every way beyond the elements that make up the world, the gross elements. And he who is released, even from these five elements, the Tanmatras, goes to the highest goal. The Lord Prajapati Brahma created all this by the mind only, by dhyana, or abstract meditation, and mystic powers, like the dhyani Buddhas. Evidently then, these Brahmanas are identical with the terrestrial bodhisattvas of the heavenly dhyani Buddhas. Both, as primordial, intelligent elements, become the creators or the emanators of the monads, destined to become human in that cycle, after which they evolve themselves, or, so to say, expand into their own selves as bodhisattvas or brahmanas, in heaven and earth, to become at last simple men. The creators of the world are born here, on earth again and again truly. In the northern Buddhist system, or the popular exoteric religion, it is taught that every Buddha, while preaching the good law on earth, manifests himself simultaneously in three worlds. In the formless world as a dhyani Buddha, in the world of forms as a bodhisattva, and in the world of desire, the lowest or our world, as a man. Esoterically, the teaching differs. The divine, purely Adi-Buddhic monad manifests as the universal Buddhi, the Mahabudhi or Mahat, in Hindu philosophies, the spiritual, omniscient and omnipotent root of divine intelligence, the highest anima mundi or the Logos. This descends like a flame spreading from the eternal fire, immovable, without increase or decrease, ever the same to the end of the cycle of existence, and becomes universal life on the mundane plane. From this plane of conscious life shoot out, like seven fiery tongues, the sons of light, the logoi of life, then the dhyani Buddhas of contemplation, the concrete forms of their formless fathers, the seven sons of light, still themselves, to whom may be applied the Brahmanical mystic phrase, "Thou art that Brahman." It is from these dhyani Buddhas that emanate their chayas or shadows, the bodhisattvas of the celestial realms, the prototypes of the super-terrestrial bodhisattvas, and of the terrestrial Buddhas, and finally of men. The seven sons of light are also called stars. The star under which a human entity is born, says the occult teaching, will remain forever its star, throughout the whole cycle of its incarnations in one Manvantara. But this is not his astrological star. The latter is concerned and connected with the personality, the former with the individuality. The angel of that star, or the dhyani Buddha connected with it, will be either the guiding, or simply the presiding, angel, so to say, in every new rebirth of the monad, which is part of his own essence, though his vehicle, man, may remain forever ignorant of this fact. The adepts have each their dhyani Buddha, their elder twin soul, and they know it, calling it Father Soul and Father Fire. It is only at the last and supreme initiation, however, when placed face to face with the bright image, that they learn to recognize it. How much did Bulwer Lytton know of this mystic fact when describing, in one of his highest inspirational moods, Zanoni face to face with his Ogoads? The Logos, or both the unmanifested and the manifested word, is called by the Hindus Ishvara, the Lord, though the occultists give it another name. Ishvara, say the Vedantins, is the highest consciousness in nature. This highest consciousness, answer the occultists, is only a synthetic unit in the world of the manifested logos or on the plane of illusion, for it is the sum total of Dhyana consciousness. O wise man, remove the conception that not spirit is spirit, says Shankaracharya. Atma is not spirit in its final parabrahmic state. Ishvara, or logos, is spirit, or, as occultism explains, it is a compound unity of manifested living spirits, the parent source and nursery of all the mundane and terrestrial monads, plus their divine reflection, which emanate from, and return into, the logos, each in the culmination of its time. There are 7 chief groups of such Dhyan Chohans, which groups will be found and recognized in every religion, for they are the primeval 7 rays. Humanity, occultism teaches us, is divided into 7 distinct groups, with their subdivisions: mental, spiritual, and physical. Hence there are 7 chief planets, the spheres of the indwelling 7 spirits, under each of which is born one of the human groups which is guided and influenced thereby. There are only 7 planets specially connected with Earth, and 12 houses, but the possible combinations of their aspects are countless. As each planet can stand to each of the others in 12 different aspects, their combinations must be almost infinite, in fact, as the spiritual, psychic, mental, and physical capacities in the numberless varieties of the genus Homo, each of which varieties is born under one of the 7 planets, and one of the said countless planetary combinations. The monad, then, viewed as one, is above the 7th principle in cosmos and man, and as a triad, it is the direct radiant progeny of the said compound unit, not the breath of God as that unit is called, nor creating out of nihil, for such an idea is quite unphilosophical, and degrades deity, dragging it down to a finite attributive condition. As well expressed by the translator of the crest jewel of wisdom, though Ishvara is God, unchanged in the profoundest depths of pralayas and in the intensest activity of manvantaras, still beyond him is Atma, round whose pavilion is the darkness of eternal Maya. The triads born under the same parent planet, or rather the radiations of one and the same planetary spirit or Dhyani are, in all their afterlives and rebirths, sister or twin souls on this earth. The idea is the same as that of the Christian Trinity, the 3 in 1, only it is still more metaphysical. The universal over spirit manifesting on the 2 higher planes, those of Buddhi and Mahat. These are the 3 hypostases, metaphysical, but never personal. This was known to every high initiate in every age and in every country. I and my Father are one, said Jesus. When he is made to say, elsewhere, I ascend to my Father and your Father, it meant that which has just been stated. The identity, and at the same time the illusive differentiation of the angel monad and the human monad is shown in the sentences. My Father is greater than I, glorify your Father which is in heaven, then shall the righteous shine forth as the sun in the kingdom of their Father, not our Father. So again Paul asks, know ye not ye are the temple of God, and that the Spirit of God dwelleth in you? All this was simply meant to show that the group of disciples and followers attracted to him belonged to the same Dhyani Buddha, star, or Father, and that this again belonged to the same planetary realm and division as he did. It is the knowledge of this occult doctrine that found expression in the review of the idyll of the White Lotus, when T. Subbaro wrote, Every Buddha meets at his last initiation. All the great adepts who reached Buddhahood during the preceding ages. Every class of adepts has its own bond of spiritual communion, which knits them together. The only possible and effectual way of entering into such brotherhood is by bringing oneself within the influence of the spiritual light which radiates from one's own logos. I may further point out here that such communion is only possible between persons whose souls derive their life and sustenance from the same divine ray, and that, as 7 distinct rays radiate from the central spiritual sun, all adepts and Dayan Chohins are divisible into 7 classes, each of which is guided, controlled, and overshadowed by one of the 7 forms or manifestations of the divine wisdom. It is then the 7 sons of light called after their planets, and often identified with them by the rabble, namely, Saturn, Jupiter, Mercury, Mars, Venus, and presumably the Sun and Moon. For the modern critic, who goes no deeper than the surface of old religions which are, according to the occult teachings, our heavenly parents, or synthetically our Father. Hence, as already remarked, polytheism is really more philosophical and correct, as to fact and nature, than is anthropomorphic monotheism. Saturn, Jupiter, Mercury, and Venus, the 4 exoteric planets, and the 3 others, which must remain unnamed, were the heavenly bodies in direct astral and psychic communication, morally and physically, with the earth, its guides and watchers, the visible orbs furnishing our humanity with its outward and 629 inward characteristics, and their regents or rectors, with our monads and spiritual faculties. In order to avoid creating new misconceptions, let it be stated that among the 3 secret orbs, or star angels, neither Uranus nor Neptune were included, not only because they were unknown under these names to the ancient sages, but because they, like all other planets, however many there may be, are the gods and guardians of other septenary chains of globes within our system. Nor do the 2 great planets last discovered depend entirely on the Sun, as do the rest of the planets. Otherwise, how can we explain the fact that Uranus receives 1/390th part of the light received by our Earth, while Neptune receives only 1/900th part, and that their satellites show a peculiarity of inverse rotation, found in no other planets of the solar system? At any rate, what we say applies to Uranus, though the fact has again been disputed recently. This subject will, of course, be considered as a mere vagary by all those who confuse the universal order of being with their own systems of classification. Here, however, simple facts from occult teachings are stated, to be either accepted or rejected, as the case may be. There are details which, on account of their great metaphysical abstraction, cannot be entered upon. Hence, we merely state that only 7 of our planets are as intimately related to our globe as the Sun is to all the bodies subject to him in his system. Of these bodies, the poor little number of primary and secondary planets known to astronomy looks wretched enough, in truth. Therefore, it stands to reason that there are a great number of planets, small and large, that have not been discovered yet, but of the existence of which ancient astronomers, all of them initiated adepts, must certainly have been aware. But, as the relation of these to the gods was sacred, it had to remain arcane, as did also the names of various other planets and stars. Besides this, even the Roman Catholic theology speaks of 70 planets that preside over the destinies of the nations of this globe, and, save the erroneous application, there is more truth in this tradition than in exact modern astronomy. The 70 planets are connected with the 70 elders of the people of Israel, and the regents of these planets are meant, not the orbs themselves. The word 70 is a play and a blind upon the 7 times 7 of the subdivisions. Each people and nation, as we have already said, has its direct watcher, guardian and father in heaven, a planetary spirit. We are willing to leave their own national god, Jehovah, to the descendants of Israel, the worshippers of Sabaoth or Saturn, for, indeed, the monads of the people chosen by him are his own, and the Bible has never made any secret of it. Only the text of the Protestant English Bible is, as usual, in disagreement with those of the Septuagint and the Vulgate. Thus, while in the former we read, "When the Most High, not Jehovah, divided to the nations their inheritance, he set the bounds of the people, according to the number of the children of Israel." In the Septuagint the text reads according to the number of the angels, planet angels, a version more concordant with truth and fact. Moreover, all the texts agree that the Lord's Jehovah's portion is his people, Jacob is the lot of his inheritance, and this settles the question. The Lord Jehovah took Israel for his portion. What have other nations to do with that particular national deity? Let then the angel Gabriel watch over Iran and Michael Jehovah over the Hebrews. These are not the gods of other nations, and it is difficult to see why Christians should have selected a God against whose commandments Jesus was the first to rise in rebellion. The planetary origin of the monad, or soul, and of its faculties was taught by the Gnostics. On its way to the earth, as on its way back from the earth, each soul born in, and from, the boundless light, had to pass through the 7 planetary regions either way. The pure Dhyani and Devas of the oldest religions had become, in course of time, with the Zoroastrians, the 7 Devs, the ministers of Ahriman, each chained to his planet, with the Brahmins, the Asuras and some of the Rishis good, bad and indifferent. Among the Egyptian Gnostics, it was Thoth, or Hermes, who was the chief of the 7, whose names are given by Origen as Adonai, genius of the sun, Tau, of the moon, Eloi, of Jupiter, Sabaoth, of Mars, Ori, of Venus, Astaphi, of Mercury, and Eldabaoth, Jehovah, of Saturn. Finally, the Pistis Sophia, which the greatest modern authority on exoteric Gnostic beliefs, the late Mr. C.W. King, refers to as that precious monument of Gnosticism. This old document echoes the archaic belief of the ages, while distorting it to suit sectarian purposes. The astral rulers of the spheres, the planets, create the monads, or souls, from their own substance out of the tears of their eyes, and the sweat of their torments, endowing the monads with a spark of their substance, which is the divine light. It will be shown in Volume 2 why these lords of the zodiac and spheres have been transformed by sectarian theology into the rebellious angels of the Christians, who took them from the 7 devs of the Magi, without understanding the significance of the allegory. As usual, that which is, and was from its beginning, divine, pure, and spiritual in its earliest unity, became by reason of its differentiation through the distorted prism of man's conceptions human and impure, as reflecting man's own sinful nature. Thus, in time, the planet Saturn became reviled by the worshippers of other gods. The nations born under Saturn, the Jewish, for instance, with whom he became Jehovah, after being considered as a son of Saturn, or Ildabaoth, by the Ophites, and in the book of Jasher were eternally fighting with those born under Jupiter, Mercury, or any other planet, except Saturn Jehovah, genealogies and prophecies notwithstanding. Jesus the Initiate, or Jehoshua, the type from whom the historical Jesus was copied, was not of pure Jewish blood, and thus recognized no Jehovah, nor did he worship any planetary god beside his own Father whom he knew, and with whom he communed, as every high initiate does, spirit to spirit and soul to soul. This can hardly be taken exception to, unless the critic explains to everyone's satisfaction the strange sentences put into the mouth of Jesus during his disputes with the Pharisees by the author of the fourth Gospel. I know that ye are Abraham's seed. I speak that which I have seen with my father, and ye do that which ye have seen with your father. Ye do the deeds of your father. Ye are of your father, the devil. He was a murderer from the beginning, and abode not in the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he speaketh a lie, he speaketh of his own, for he is a liar and the father of it. This father of the Pharisees was Jehovah, for he was identical with Cain, Saturn, Vulcan, the planet under which they were born, and the god whom they worshipped. Evidently there must be an occult meaning sought in these words and admonitions, however mistranslated, since they are pronounced by one who threatened with hellfire anyone who says to his brother simply "Raka, fool." And evidently, again, the planets are not merely spheres, twinkling in space, and made to shine for no purpose, but they are the domains of various beings with whom the uninitiated are so far unacquainted, but who have, nevertheless, a mysterious, unbroken, and powerful connection with men and globes. Every heavenly body is the temple of a god, and these gods themselves are the temples of God, the unknown, not spirit. There is nothing profane in the universe. All nature is a consecrated place, as Jung says. Each of these stars is a religious house. Thus can all exoteric religions be shown to be the falsified copies of the esoteric teaching. It is the priesthood which has to be held responsible for the reaction of our day in favor of materialism. It is by worshipping and enforcing on the masses the worship of the shells of pagan ideals personified for purposes of allegory that the latest exoteric religion has made of Western lands a pandemonium, in which the higher classes worship the golden calf, and the lower and ignorant masses are made to worship an idol with feet of clay. And that's not all. Our experts and regular viewers respond to all comments. Also check if you forgot to subscribe and set your bell to receive notifications about new audiobooks and other useful self-development materials that we release regularly. Join in the discussions, don't forget to give likes and, if possible and inspired, support the development of the channel financially. All useful links will be in the description and the first attached comment. Goodness, love and wisdom to all. And now move on to watch the next part of the video at the links below, or choose something from the playlists of the channel and those you see on the screen.